We've noted previously there were various echelons among Jesus' disciples. There was, of course, the big three, Peter, James, and John. Then there were the 12. Then there were the 70. You remember that subgroup that was sent out by Jesus to the highways and byways of Palestine, and they came back and reported to Jesus on their success or lack of it? Now, the 70 are very interesting, and it would be fun to know what their names were. Now, Eusebius, our earliest church historian, does not give us all the names, but he does mention several of them. For example, he says that Barnabas, that son of encouragement, that's what Barnabas means, who was the headhunter who discovered Paul of Tarsus, you recall, and went along on the first mission journey with him, was one of those 70. Another was the Sosthenes, who is mentioned as an associate of Paul in 1 Corinthians 1. Then we have one of the 70 named Thaddeus, who's going to have a very important role, as we shall see in a short time, when he was an emissary to the King of Edessa. It's these lovely little nooks and crannies of the ancient past in church history that Eusebius is so fond of filling for us. Again, he relies on the traditions at the great centers of Christianity, the library of the Bishop of Jerusalem, and then the archives in Antioch or Alexandria down in Egypt, and then even as far west as Rome itself. Those were the earliest centers of Christianity, and Eusebius was a wide-ranging scholar, traveled to most of those places, and took notes constantly. And we have the results today in his church history. Now, early in his church history, Eusebius tells us of a letter written to Jesus by the King of Edessa. Now, where in the world is Edessa? Edessa is at the northwestern corner of the Euphrates River. It is in southeastern Turkey today. And the king of Edessa's name was Abgar-Uhama. And indeed, there are lots of Abgar-Uhamas, the first, second, third, and so forth, in the dynasty at Edessa. And now he records a letter which this king wrote to Jesus of Nazareth. Not only that, but we've even got Jesus' reply. Now that's pretty sensational material. Let's talk about it and see what the letter said. Now Eusebius claims that when he was in Edessa, he was researching the archives there, and he found this correspondence. So he's not lying to us, and so we know that the correspondence was there. The big question is, are those letters on record at Edessa authentic or not? Now, here is the letter which the king writes to Jesus. Abgar-Uhama, the king, to Jesus, the excellent Savior, who has appeared in the region of Jerusalem, greeting. I have heard about you and the cures that you accomplish without drugs or herbs. Word has it that you make the blind see and the lame walk, that you heal lepers and cast out unclean spirits and demons, and that you cure those tortured by chronic disease, and you even raise the dead. When I heard all these things about you, I decided that one of two things is true. Either you were God and came down from heaven to do these things, or you were God's son for doing them. For this reason, I'm writing to beg you to take the trouble to come and heal me of my suffering. I've also heard that the Jews are murmuring against you and plot to harm you. Now, my city-state is very small, but highly regarded and quite adequate for the both of us. Jesus, you're in trouble. Hey, I got a nice shelter for you. Just come north and we'll have a good time. I love it. Now, here is Jesus' purported reply. Fascinating. He says, "Blessed are you who believed in me without seeing me. For it is written that those who have seen me will not believe, and those who have not seen me will believe and live. Now, regarding your request that I come to you, I must first complete all that I was sent to do here. And once this is completed, I must be taken up to the one who sent me. When I have been taken up, I will send one of my disciples to heal your suffering and bring life to you and yours." And one of the disciples, named Thomas, you remember him, sent Thaddeus, one of the 70, who then the records report went to Edessa and healed the king after the ascension of Jesus. Now, if this is true, of course, it's sensational. I think we'd have to agree. We don't have any other recorded letters from Jesus. But is it authentic? Probably a balance of the world's scholars would say that it is not. Now, they're not impugning Eusebius's veracity here. He certainly tells us that he went there and that he saw them with his own eyes, and he would not lie to us. But could he have been taken in? Eusebius was not a critical historian in the modern sense. There are several things in favor of the letter and one or two against. In favor of the letter would be nothing in it is impossible. Those places existed. Jesus, the context of that letter would be authentic. His cadences, those who have seen won't believe, those who have not seen will believe. That sounds very much like what he told Thomas himself, you recall, when he had to empirically prove that he had risen from the dead. Here, put your fingers in my wounds and so forth. But on the other hand, in that letter, Jesus does say, I must fulfill all those things written about me. Now, if he's referring then to the gospel records, that would prove that it would be a forgery. Because obviously the gospel records had not yet been written down. Jesus hasn't even gone to Golgotha yet. But if Jesus were here referring to the Old Testament prophecies predicting his ministry, all those things written about me, well, then that argument has no validity. And it is just possible that it could be true. It's a fascinating question. I suppose when I put on my critical goggles, I would say, as I do in the commentary, this narrative is a romanticizing of factual material. Christianity reached Edessa very early, at least by AD 150, and its king, probably Abgar Uchama VIII, was baptized. A church was constructed at Edessa. The Greek New Testament was translated here into Syriac language, and this is also the home of the Christian scholars Tatian and Barnabas, whom Eusebius will mention subsequently. So we'll have to leave it at that. We can't say categorically that these are false. We can't say categorically they're true. I do find them interesting, and I do think that the early church also found them interesting in general, Eusebius in particular. Other characters show up in the New Testament, and Eusebius tells us more about them. And this is always so thrilling to me, to get fresh information about biblical personalities. I love this quest. I think I've been at it ever since Sunday school, when I was always asking these impossible questions of the Sunday school teacher. Not to put her on the spot, but because I wanted to know. I was so tuned in, so turned on by these episodes that I always wanted to know more. You know, and tell us more, Luke. Don't just leave us hanging there. I was convinced the first thing I was going to do when I got to heaven was locate Luke and asked him what happened after Acts 28 breaks off. You know, Paul's getting set for his trial before Nero, and then he does a fade out on us. A very modern device, a fade out, a little unbiblical, you know. There are answers to these questions, and by the way, Eusebius provides quite a few of those answers. Now, another creepy character shows up in the book of Acts named Simon Magus. Remember Acts chapter 8? Philip brings the good news up to Samaria, And there he meets this Simon character. Simon Magus means Simon the magician. And he was a sleight of hand artist and probably a spiritual con man as well. But he noticed that Philip could do miracles, and when Peter got up to Samaria as well and did stupendous wonders, well, that blew Simon's mind. And you recall, according to Luke's account in the book of Acts, he tries to purchase the power to do miracles from Simon Peter. Wrong request. In some of the strongest language Peter ever used. He told him what he could do with his money. Go right down to the devil with it. And at that point, I love Simon's reaction. Oh, please pray to your God that none of those terrible things you said about me will ever happen. I love it. And the implication is that he then became a converted Christian. Well, if so, he was only a Christian for a very short time, because Eusebius tells the rest of his story. And it's kind of interesting. It really is. Simon finally made an honest woman out of the prostitute he was associating with. Her name was Helen. And they went off to Rome. And they then were quite the sensation in Rome, and causing all kinds of trouble to the Christian church there. But rather than my telling it, why don't we simply turn to Eusebius and get his report? And by the way, Eusebius regularly tells us that this Simon Magus was the grandfather of all the heresies in the early church. They all seem to spring from this character. Of such evil, Simon was the father. Nevertheless, our Savior's inspired apostles quickly extinguished the flames of the evil one before they could spread. And no conspiracy by Simon or any of his contemporaries succeeded in those apostolic days. After the impostor's crimes were exposed in Judea by the apostle Peter, he quickly fled overseas from east to west so that he could live as he wished. Arriving in Rome, he achieved such success that the citizens erected his statue and honored Simon as a god. But his success was brief. Hot on his heels in the same reign of the Emperor Claudius, a gracious providence brought to Rome the great and mighty Peter, chosen for his merits as leader of the other apostles. Like a noble captain of the faith, he proclaimed the gospel of light and the word that saves people's souls. With this divine word, Simon's power was extinguished and destroyed immediately, along with the man himself. He tells us elsewhere that Simon, in order to gain his following, was going to fly before the people. So he had a great big tower erected in the suburbs of Rome. And he was going to fly, and all, of course, the hundreds of thousands gathered. Probably some ancient version of a bungee cord operation or something. In any case, Simon flew off the tower, and the bungee cord broke, and he was killed, showman to the end. What's interesting is the mileage that would accrue to his name. I mean, Simon never leaves the stages of history, because later on, in the Middle Ages, when they were buying and selling church office, what did they call it? Simony or simony, in his dishonor. A terrible thing. Religious payola named in honor, I should say, of this fellow. So he's never really going to leave the scene at all. Did Simon Peter ever get to Rome? That's certainly implicit in Eusebius' record. And there's an interesting interchange here now between Peter, Paul, and Nero, who are not a musical group, of course. Paul, we know, got to Rome. That is very, very clear in the book of Acts. Paul wants to get to Rome. That's what his epistle is all about, to the people in Rome. We know he got there, but the New Testament doesn't tell us that Peter got to Rome. Now, In the old ultra-Protestantizing days, when the Protestants says they were all right and the Catholics were all wrong, they tried to dismantle the papacy by saying the first pope was Peter. Oh, he never even got to Rome. Impossible. Well, we're not debating whether the first pope was Peter, but he did get to Rome.
There is overpowering evidence that he did. Early Christian art at Rome shows both Peter and Paul prominently figured. For example, an ancient glass plate has been discovered showing Peter on the left side with his nicely trimmed beard, and Paul on the right, half bald and with a fuller beard. In the catacombs also, we find prayers addressed both to Peter and to Paul. And in the earliest traditions of the church, according to Eusebius, Peter did get to Rome.
And he quotes some fascinating original sources. In the church at Rome, he got hold of a document written by an elder there named Gaius. And he was writing Christians in the East. And he was inviting them to come to Rome. And when they came to Rome, he would be happy to show them where the Apostle Peter was buried and the Vatican Hill. Now, Vatican sounds like a Roman Catholic word, doesn't it? It's not. It's not even a Latin word. The Vatican Valley, to the northwest of Rome, was first named by the Etruscans, would you believe? 900 BC. But in any case, there was a hippodrome there, a horse race circus, that had been erected by Caligula, the mad emperor. He loved horses, and that's where he raced them. And it was Caligula who had erected in the center of the spina, or spine, of that hippodrome, a large 86-foot obelisk. Then he bequeathed that, of course, to a later emperor, Nero. Now, it was in the Vatican Hippodrome that the first persecution against the church took place under Nero, the one I've referred to repeatedly, recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus. And what's fascinating is that that is proven to be the Hippodrome because the other great stadium, the Circus Maximus, was a cinder. That had been burnt up. And so if Nero is going to persecute the Christians publicly to deflect the guilt for setting Rome on fire from himself to these arsonists, these Christians, that is the Hippodrome that he used. And so it was that obelisk in the center of that Hippodrome which first witnessed the great persecution of the church, and as a matter of fact, it stands today in the great colonnade in front of St. Peter's Basilica. 86 feet high, came from Egypt. Caligula brought it in, and then Nero inherited it. And that's the obelisk that whenever I take a tour group to Rome, I like to get away from the tour group because I talk to the obelisk. Very one-way conversation. My opening line to the obelisk is, "Get a life. Tell me about that persecution that you saw, In the 16th century, they moved that obelisk from the Vatican Valley Hippodrome about 300 yards further north to St. Peter's Basilica Colonnade. They had a terrible time moving it. Oh, the ropes started smoking. They almost lost the thing. The ancients had no trouble, whatever, putting these things up. It's the medieval sorts later on who had terrible trouble erecting the obelisk. What's fascinating, though, is that part of Gaius's letter now to his friends in the East, come to Rome and I'll show you a good time. I'll show you where Peter's buried. He also says, I will show you where the other great apostle, St. Paul, is buried. And he would take them out to the Via Ostiensis. That's the Ostian Way, which leads from Rome southwest to the present day yet. When you fly into Rome International Airport, you land at Leonardo da Vinci Airport, and you take the Via Ostiensis into Rome. 3 miles outside the city of Rome is the great Basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls.
And it was here that the great apostle, the greatest apostle, in fact, was probably buried. In early Christian mosaics, Paul always appears somewhat balding, and with a pointed beard.
The Basilica of St. Paul today looks out on the Via Ostiensis. It is perhaps fitting that the apostle who traveled so much, 3 mission journeys, so magnificently, maybe 4 in the voyage to Rome, should have been buried on the way to Rome's international airport. I'm not sure that Paul at that point was particularly thrilled with that location, but you know, there's a lot of authenticity here, because under the high altar of the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, there's an inscription with a Latin dative, Paulo Apostolo Martiro, to Paul, apostle and martyr. And the lettering style is Constantinian, and it was the first Christian emperor, Constantine, who was the one who laid the foundations for St. Peter's Basilica, the old structure, not the present one that is so incredibly large, but the present one was built on the partial foundations of the old one, and it was also Constantine who erected the Basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls. So there's a lot going on here in terms of authenticity. It was an exciting time for the church. It was a tragic time for the church, all because of Nero. Nero was emperor from 54 to 68 AD. And he was in Rome in July in the year 64 when an accidental fire broke out southeast of his palace. You commonly hear, of course, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. 2 things wrong with it. Nero was 35 miles away at the time giving a concert. Yeah, believe it or not. He thought he had a good voice. It's not a perfect alibi, but usually arsonists want to be on hand when their magnificent flaming creation gets started. And by the way, the chief loser in the fire of Rome, Nero. He lost more than anybody else. So he was a fool if he set the fire right next to his palace, southeast of it, when there was a southeastern wind blowing to the northwest. Yeah, there was a Scirocco born in Libya, shot up the peninsula of Italy, and turned Rome into a horrible inferno for about 9 days and nights. It was a terrible, terrible time indeed. Nero then blamed the Christians, and now a persecution of the Christians begins, which will not be lifted officially until 250 years later, when the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity. It was in connection with this persecution then that the 2 greatest apostles, Peter and Paul, were both martyred, and so there is no question that Peter and Paul did intersect with Nero negatively. Both of them got to Rome, and they are regarded more or less as the co-founders of the Christian church in Rome. Next time, we will talk about the Roman attitude toward the Christians from that point on under subsequent emperors.